Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. You may not know Bill C-18 by name, but if passed, it promises to change permanently how consumers acquire and pay for news. Peter Menzies has called it a shakedown of big tech, and he joins us today to discuss. Peter is a senior fellow at Macdonald-Laurier Institute think tank and a former vice chairman of the CRTC. Welcome back, Peter.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here as always.
So maybe tell our audience a little bit about this bill in your own words, what it proposes to do.
Well, what it proposes to do is to force online companies, large ones, like typically let's use Facebook and Google are the ones named, although the act itself allows the CRTC to further define who the subjects might be. So it could be Twitter as well. And what it does is it insists that those companies pay money to online news organizations or news organizations that function online. This began with newspapers lobbying for this, attempting to make the case that somehow Facebook and Google are inappropriately profiting from the use of their news. Facebook, particularly early on, was quite vocal about the fact that it believes this is nonsense. And even though it doesn't quite say so publicly anymore, it believes that the value it gives to these companies by giving them free access to large audiences far exceeds what they have. Anyway, that said, the government has decided that the companies should pay, or the online companies should pay news organizations. At the end of the day, even the CBC piled in on this to get more money, in addition to broadcasters who hadn't even thought about it until about a year ago and never really publicly made a case that they should get it. So at the end of the day, Facebook and Google and others, maybe Twitter, maybe LinkedIn, maybe more, will be basically forced at the point of a legislative gun to come to a commercial agreement with the news organizations, and then at the end of that, the CRTC will have to approve those agreements.
So there's a requirement to come to a commercial agreement where basically funds will be transferred from the online sort of giants like Google and Facebook to these journalistic enterprises, let's put it that way. If they don't come to an agreement, what happens then?
If they don't come to an agreement, then the CRTC will appoint an arbitrator, or maybe mediation first, and then sort of a final sort of baseball-style arbitration, I believe is what is conceived, and then both parties will have to live with that. Baseball arbitration, it's winner take all. You pick your number, I pick my number, and then somebody decides which one of us is right, and one of us takes everything. There's no middle ground, so it rarely goes to that.
Right.
The fact of the matter is that Facebook and others and Google have already come to some sort of agreements on a certain basis. What they are, we don't know. They're private commercial arrangements, and money began to flow to some last year. Post Media was, I believe, the last holdout that came to no agreement.
Okay.
So we're really going to have, what this does is it really puts, at the end of the day, the CRTC will approve these agreements. The legislation insists that the money has to be spent on domestic news coverage, local, regional, national. So we're going to get into this situation where, and in order to get some money, you have to be a qualified news organization,
right,
and there will be a government-appointed panel deciding whether you are qualified or not. So we've really got, like the phrase I use, the state is very much in the newsrooms of the nation now, which is something that, even 10 years ago for most newspaper publishers and editors, and I'm an old one of those, was just unimaginable.
We've got just about a half a minute before our first break. Can you at least start us on the conversation on why these journalistic enterprises need to do this? What is wrong with the industry that this has got to be their salvation?
Well, the internet has pretty much eaten their lunch. It's a long story, but you can start with Kijiji and free classified ads. Huge revenue streams that newspapers used to be massive money earners, and the internet, we can get into that further, just really
Let's
took
take the
all that
break
away.
now because this is an important point. I don't want to chop it up. Let's delve a little bit deeper on the economics of the journalism and why they're sort of coming bowl in hand to government to kind of bail them out through the large online organizations. So take us through that a little bit, Peter.
Sure. Well, let's just go back and take a look at what newspapers used to be, for starters. People think of them, and they still think of themselves, or certainly the journalists think of themselves as they're all about news. But they were about way, way more than news back in the day. You know, that when I was a newspaper publisher, you could print the most outrageous op-ed and you'd get some phone calls on that. But if you failed to deliver the Canadian Tire flyer on Thursday morning on time, then you could really light people up. So advertising was the reason people bought papers. If you were looking for a job, you bought a newspaper. If you were looking to hire somebody, you put an ad in the newspaper, or looked in the newspaper for somebody you needed. If your daughter got married, if your grandma died, that's where all that information was in there. Comics, horoscopes, crosswords. It was, entertainment, movie reviews. There's tons of stuff in there. And the internet blew it all up. I mean, all of a sudden, classified advertising, which was a huge revenue area, disappeared. Car dealers could suddenly create their own websites. They didn't have to buy as many ads. They still do buy ads, but they didn't have to buy as many ads in your newspapers anymore. Realtors could set up their own websites, could do their own publications. People could just surf on the web for things if you were looking to buy a car, for instance, whereas in the past, you had to buy the newspaper in order to see the car ads. So it all disappeared like that.
So they see this Bill C-18, as a part of their salvation then?
Yeah, in Canada in particularly, and a lot of Canada's newspaper structure was really damaged by the CanWest bankruptcy and everything that happened through there. So you got a lot of consolidation. The companies were weakened badly to begin with. Some of these grand old titles, Ben Franklin founded the Montreal Gazette. This is sad to see things like this happening, but they are happening. And they really, in many ways, are on their last legs. They have failed to adapt, probably more difficult in Canada than any other country I know of. Newspapers have struggled around the world, but because they had such an advertising-based model as opposed to reader sales subscription-based model, they've really struggled. So this is they're reaching for the life preserver on this one.
Right. So government has this bill C-18. You've made the point. I mean, was some precedence in Australia, the so-called Australia model, but you've said that this Canadian government bill goes way beyond that. So maybe explain to our audience that juxtaposition.
Well, it does in that it and I don't know why they did this, but they did, because with so much of their legislation, they go much farther than they need to, and it kind of messes it up, right? Yeah. They're not targeted at all, and they leave definitions up to other people. But what they've done is they've decided that, and Minister Rodriguez said this, that a link has a value.
Right.
We've put a value on a link. Now, in 2011, the Supreme Court ruled that, like a hyperlink, that it doesn't have a commercial value, right? So, and nobody thinks they have a value, right? If I were to, you guys send me a link to this Zoom call, right? Does it have an economic value? Should I be paying for it? Should you be paying for it? Of course it doesn't have it. There is no commercial value to the link itself. But the Department of Heritage has now invented one, which once, it's like, what are the unintended consequences of suddenly doing that? And why do newspapers or news organizations get paid for their link? Approved news organizations, not unapproved ones, don't. Mm-hmm. And I don't if I post a picture of my grandchildren on Facebook. Facebook's making some money from that, right? It's user-generated content. Why don't I get, where's my check?
Right, right. So that's the model that Canada came up with, unprecedented and probably contrary to a Supreme Court decision, it sounds like. So do you
Yeah,
think there?
exactly. And if the problem with that is, even if you take the newspaper's side on it, right? And
Right,
there's a big discussion as to whether there's economic merit to their discussion or not, which you're not going to see a lot of debate on that in the pages of newspapers. But even if you accept that, this creates the opportunity for a further delay for court challenges and that sort of
right.
stuff. And
Yeah.
I don't think those guys have that much time.
Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Peter Menzies, former vice chair of the CRTC. Please continue your point, Peter, and then I want to ask you about what you see as the long-term effects of this legislation.
Yeah, well, I think the big mistake here is overreach again, right? So they've overreached. They've decided to commodify links, right? And which have already been ruled illegal by the Supreme, to not have a financial value by the Supreme Court. This creates the prospect of big court delays. Facebook is just speechless, right? When they saw this, and Rachel Curran, their rep, is quoted in the Post this morning as saying that they haven't responded. This is 2 or 3 weeks later. There's really trying to figure things out. They've been de-emphasizing news for 4 years now. They don't see it as a big area for them. And they haven't taken off the table the idea that they might do what they did in Australia initially, and that was just not take any content, ban news links, in other words. So whether it's the Globe and Mail or the Post or the Star or your local Bugle, Daily Bugle, they would say, no, sorry, we're just not accepting any more news links. And then you kind of find out who needs who the most in that argument. But it causes unnecessary, it opens a door for unnecessary fighting and wrangling and courts and court appeals and that sort of stuff that could go on for ages, when if you really just wanted to push people to say, hey, come to an agreement, money would begin flowing sooner rather than later. And there's a lot of newspapers that need the money. There's some new innovators that are refusing to go along with this and won't let themselves be regulated by the government too. And that's another issue.
So where do we go from here? First of all, do you see this ultimately as a distortion of the marketplace? And secondly, if so or if not, what do you see as the long-term effects of this?
Well, I see it actually, frankly, as a short-term solution, one way or the other.
I see.
Nobody knows exactly how much money flowed in Australia. But in Australia, the dynamics were different. And I think Canadian publishers would be making a mistake to not recognize that, and perhaps they do. But Rupert Murdoch was the guy behind this in Australia. And, Rupert Murdoch is a very, very powerful man in Australia. There's not an Australian prime minister that doesn't fear him. Right. So he kind of gets what he wants on these things, but also the agreements there in Australia would have included News Corp, which, which Rupert Murdoch owns, which is a multinational company.
Right.
So the idea that Canadian publishers are going to get that, the same amount of money is wrong. But secondly, I'm not sure even if it was for the entire industry, a couple $100 million a year, which I think it might be maybe half that. Don't really know, I'm just guessing. But even if it was as high as 200 million, which it won't be, it's not going to be enough to change the market, right? The problems that news organizations are facing and that old newspapers in particular are facing, won't be fixed by that amount of money. Once you take, it sounds like a lot, but once you sprinkle it across the country, it's a few $million here and there. And that's not going to make a difference. The tax credit $100 million a year worth that, or $120 million a year that the government brought in. It's been there for 2 years. It's now pretty permanent. It hasn't created a single journalist job, right? So you're going to throw another 100 million in a year or so. Is it, will it save a few? Probably. Will it buy you more time to innovate and find a solution and be entrepreneurial? Yes, but if you think you can count on it forever, I mean, that's the problem with innovation. If you don't have to innovate, why would you?
Yeah. So from your perspective, it doesn't solve the issue of the long-term decline of the legacy media business model then?
Yeah, I mean, Bob Cox I think he just retired in the fall, but he was sort of leading the newspaper lobbying campaign on this. And he was, is well-known publisher of the Winnipeg Free Press. And even when they were pushing it early on, he indicated that, look, at the end of the day, that none of these things are not going to be our salvation.
We'll be right back with our discussion. Please stay with us. We're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Peter Menzies of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Peter, please continue with your last thought there.
Yeah, what I was saying was that we're creating this relationship between government and news organizations that, like I said, like back when 20 years ago, people would have died on that hill. No publisher, no editor would have thought that appropriate. And it doesn't really matter what their principles are. And the problem is it undermines the public's faith in their objectivity. And media depends on public trust, right? I mean, even the advertising department at newspapers, made money through that trust. Advertisers felt that if they trusted on the pages of a trusted newspaper, they would get a better impact than on the pages of a non-trusted newspaper. Anytime you have a dependency on a government agency or the government in power for your, finances like that, people are going to doubt your credibility. And one of the problems with C18 is there's a lack of transparency in terms of these relationships, right? The government forces the online companies to make these deals with you, but then you don't have to actually reveal what the deal is.
Right.
So, those things cascade. So it's kind of like this is not a cure, and it may worsen faith in media, and that's not good. We need to have media that can be trusted, that is widely trusted, and in order to get a consistent shared understanding of the news of the day. There's a lot of issues to be dealt with.
A lot of issues, and I'd be remiss if I didn't sort of tie this into Elon Musk's bid for Twitter, which appears to be going ahead. And Elon Musk is basing his bid on a freedom of speech kind of platform that he thinks it should be. How does that interplay with this, if at all?
Well, it plays into the fact that Elon Musk might be coming up against, in Canada at least, might be coming up to the government that is currently the most interested in regulating the internet for a variety of reasons. I mean, there's Bill C11, which is about streaming. There's this Bill C18 we're talking about. There's still to come is the Online Harms Act, which has gone back to the drawing board a couple of times because it was so repressive of free speech that it was it was outrageous. People left and right were denouncing it. Twitter actually in its submission came out and said that, well, this is exactly when you talk about online safety, you're using the same excuses that governments like China, Iran, and North Korea use. And that made even the front page of the Globe and Mail, I think, last week. So when you start messing around with this, like Musk is a good businessman, so he's not going to probably try to go to war with any country. Whatever its laws are, its laws will be. But people in Canada on Twitter, the the free speech libertarians on the one hand who are celebrating that now their savior has arrived. I'm sorry, guys, that's not true. You might get a better balance that if you were seeking it, but also on the left, the people who are like, oh my goodness, the floodgates are now open. It's just going to be a spewing, Twitter will just be spewing white supremacism and hate and that sort of stuff. They're both wrong. At the end of the day, the government will be, and the laws of the land as they exist on hate speech, on child pornography, on all kinds of other things that go on still exist. It's not a lawless land. But as the government in Canada comes through and seems very keen on, having some restrictions on speech, Elon Musk is not going to win the fight with the government of Canada.
No.
Although they might like to have one.
We'll stay tuned. I'll order the popcorn. We've got 20 seconds left. Do you think this bill is going to go through as is?
Yeah, I'm afraid it is going to go through as is. I mean, there could be some. I would think that the newspapers themselves, the news organizations themselves, might want to ask for some amendments to make things a little less controversial, to make the fight a little less likely. Right. Because these guys need, you look at the, Post Media's last quarter reports, they need money and they need it soon.
Our time is up. The debate will continue. However, Peter Menzies, it's been great having you on the program. Hope to have you back soon.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Tony.